Time to talk about sky race leaders and rulers and gods and whatever else. Um, so, uh, these next three videos are going to be for this series of rulers and leaders is going to be me going over the different ones that are involved with the different sky races. So, the Skypeans, the Bjerkans, and the Shandorans. Shandians, Shandorians, however you want to put it. Um, and I'm going to be I kind of broke them up into three different sets. So this first one is going to be specifically about like the different chiefs that we see in regards to the Shandian, so the ones we saw 400 years ago with Calgara and Noland, and then the current ones, and then also adding in kind of the old gods, so some of the gods that the Shandians worshipped, so giant snake, Nola, stuff like that. And then also going into the god of Skypiea 400 years ago. Bits of that. Plus some just like kind of thoughts that I have about that. Next week's video will be about Enaru, Enel, however you want to put it. I just call him Enel most of the time. Because there's multiple variations of how to put his name, will be next week's. We'll specifically talk about him and his god's army and whatever. And then the week after that will be Gonfall, because Gonfall is the current god of Skypiea. And I will be talking about his past and, just him as much as we know about him at the moment. And like his current setup of what's going on with Skypiea and like a new age that they've entered into. So, first up, time to talk about a little bit of the history, of course, with the different sky races. As we pretty much know because of the Enaru cover story, his great adventure in space on the moon, whatever you want to call it, that thing. We know that the Shandorians, the Bjerkans, and the Skypeans all came from the moon. They all originally lived on one of the moons of the One Piece world, and or as Enaru calls it, the fairy verse. That they all used to live up there. And they all seemed to get along rather well. They all lived in one society, and they all built all of these different automata and everything like that that helped them. And they had enough wherewithal and ability to be able to make all of these different carvings all over the walls to tell their story. And it explains that eventually they left because they ran out of resources on the moon, which I guess is applicable considering there's different variations where we're going to run out of resources here on Earth as well. We're not careful. And so they each leave. They kind of have three different tribes, and the way that you kind of tell them apart is based on kind of like their wings. So we have the carving where we have like certain wings that go up, go down, and some other stuff. And eventually all three of the different groups leave the moon. The Skypeans and the Bjerkans both settle in the White Sea, while the Shandorians end up making it all the way down to the Blue Sea, where they settle on Jaya, or what would eventually be called Jaya. And they end up, spreading out over that island. And eventually, they end up building up, the giant, the city of gold, Shandora, and they eventually end up having something that is connected to the Void Century because they have poneglyphs. And they have some various connections to things like that, but they seem to be at their height before the Void Century, and then the Void Century happened, and different things happened with the 20 kingdoms. They were probably invaded at some point in time by some of the 20 kingdoms, and they eventually kind of fell into becoming just like this little small tribe that is very much based off of like Native Americans from here in the US. Because like the Skypean, the Shandorian setup is kind of based off between like Native Americans and then also like Aztec and Mayan type stuff, given some of the different art designs that we see in the different temples and stuff like that. But admittedly, there's connections there to stuff with Native Americans anyway. And eventually, of course, what ends up happening is their poneglyph specifically contains information about where Poseidon is, which of course will guide, future generations. In regards to things that go about in regards to their rulers slash beliefs. So I haven't gone too much into like beliefs with many of the others, but these kind of move into some of the things that this describe for how they rule. So originally the Shandians believed that they believed in ancient worship. So you know, we know that they have sacrifices. We know that they have their giant snake god, Kashigami, who is what they believe is a giant god, that is this huge freaking snake that they used to worship, and before it was killed by Nolan. I'll get to that in a little bit. They lived on the island of Jaya, and they tended to be a very hostile group of people to anybody that tended to show up on the island, which, I mean, I don't blame them. Given that probably some of their last interactions with people resulted in them becoming kind of almost wiped out, or becoming a much smaller population than they were, you know, before everything happened with the Void Century and the 20 Kingdoms. I don't blame them in the slightest. Also, I would not be surprised if a bunch of the Celestial Dragons wanted to get their hands on the gold that is in the city of Shandora. So that wouldn't be surprising. And what ends up happening is, of course, you know, the Shandorians, or the Shandia, as they're called, the Shandia, at that point in time, they basically end up all getting, there's this sickness that starts going through their people, and they end up deciding that they're going to sacrifice a virgin to their god, to Kashigami, because that kind of seems to be something that is a good idea to them at the time. Not. So they're getting ready to sacrifice the girl, and in comes Nolan, who kills Kashigami, saves her, and then ends up basically convincing them to let him be able to find a cure. We know that, and I am going to talk a little bit about like Calgara and Nolan and stuff like that. But, you know, throughout the course of what happens with the Shandians is, of course, you know, everything happens with Nolan. They start figuring out that, okay, maybe there's a better way of what we can do here. We don't need to worship these giant snakes. We can do it this. We can, you know, use, you know, Nolan, you know, fix the disease so they're not dying anymore. But then they cut down trees, and then there's this whole big miscommunication of things on both sides. And, you know, the Shandians vow, once they find out what happened, they vow that they will, you know, that they will ring the bell, and hopefully it will help bring Nolan back, that, you know, he can return someday. And then, of course, you know, you know, what is it called? The sky current. No, that's not it. The, knock-up stream. I'm like, I know this word. The knock-up stream happens and knocks, you know, half of Jaya into the sky, into Skypiea, and there it is, of course, claimed by the god of Skypiea at the time, who I'll talk about in a little bit, who claims it as his new realm, as the realm of the god, because it's Verth, and everything happens there. Eventually, we know that later on, you know, the Skypeans and the Shandorians end up having this, you know, this fight that goes back and forth, where basically the Shandorians basically just end up being more like bandits and nuisances and everything like that to the Skypeans for quite a while, for the next 400 years or so. And then eventually Eneru comes along with his Sky Knights, with his, you know, God's army and everything. And then, of course, the Straw Hats show up, and everything happens there, and eventually things are kind of worked out to the point where currently in the story, the Shandians and the Skypeans are actually allies and actually living in peace with each other, which I'll go over obviously more when it comes to, you know, Gonfall and Eneru when I go over their videos. So we see a lot of that. So in regards to Kashigami, which is this giant frickin' snake, is one of the giant snakes. It's the same type of a snake that Nola is. Kashigami is actually Nola's grandparent. The Skypeans worship Kashigami as a god, but given the fact that a lot of them were very surprised when they saw this giant snake, they may not have seen the god very often. It may not have been something that popped up all that often, but because of the fact that they were being ravaged by the disease, by the tree fever, they're like, okay, we need to do something about this, and everything happens there. And they try to sacrifice Moose, who is actually Kalgura's daughter. Now, I didn't want to point out here, I'm not saying that Kashigami is their ruler, but because of this connection to what happens with, because of the fact that this is kind of being done on the, the chief is kind of the one that's, going over this, I wanted to make this comparison here. And the fact that, like, the Shandians come from this time frame where they have, where they start worship, where they have this god that they worshipped, and then of course everything happens where Nolan kills Kashigami, and then Kalgura ends up killing Kashigami's child, and then eventually they find Nola, who is clearly like the grandchild of Kashigami. They're like, okay, and Nola becomes like a friend to Kalgura and Nolan and Seto and the people of Shandia. And, Nola, of course, as I went over in, my Animals and Allies video, when I would talk about Nola as her possibly being like an ally to the Straw Hats, that, she, for 400 years, didn't really get to see any of the Shandians very often because they were, kicked out of Upper Yard, and, what was the half of Jaya became Upper Yard. And she was just kind of there for the next 400 years. And yeah, she probably had to deal a lot with, whatever god and Skypiea god at that point in time was there, but she just missed her friends. And eventually she does kind of go a little bit feral, but that's changed now that she actually has her, has the Shandians back in her life. And so we have that. And I did want to point out that obviously, as has been pointed out much more recently in stuff with One Piece, Moose, Kalgura's daughter, is actually the first person to actually mention the sun god. Not by name, but she mentions the sun god. And so there's like that connection there that connects back to Luffy, and of course him being, sun god Nika with the devil fruit and everything. So I wanted to point that out there, because there's not really a whole lot of other abilities where I have the ability to point that out. I did also want to point out that in regards to trivia about Kashigami, because again, there's some of the stuff that I find interesting, and it's like, this isn't going to get brought up in any other video, so I'm going to throw it in here. Kashi means oak in Japanese, and Gami comes from the kanji for God. So we also know that the Shandians believed that the spirits of their ancestors resided in certain trees in the forest, and that's why they were very angry when Nolan cut them down. So Kashigami basically means oak god, is kind of what it translates to. And then, as I stated, although Kashigami is labeled as this god for the Shandorians at the time, a lot of them are very taken aback by the fact that it's a giant snake when it shows up for the ritual. So there's that. Nola, a little bit about Nola here, which I've mentioned in other stuff before, but I'll just piece it here together a little bit. Nola is also known as the Master of the Sky. It's the giant snake that lived in Upper Yard. It's also the one that was a companion of Kalgura and Nolan and Seto, who is Kalgura's son-in-law, because he marries Moose, making him another ancestor of Wiper. And, as I said, Nola has been living on Skypiea in, Upper Yard for the last 400 years, kind of on her own, kind of trying to like protect the city and everything like that. We know that Nola loved it when they would like ring the bell, and that bell hasn't really been rung for 400 years. So she's sad about that. And we also see her being exceedingly happy when the bell is finally rang again by Luffy when he defeats Eneru. And of course, now, as I stated, Nola is able to be with the Shandians and the Skypeans and actually be able to be happy again with them, because we see her with Rocky and Conus and Isa And we know that she also like works at like this giant Usopp themed rubber band amusement park, which is funny. Um, so we also, so we see a lot of that. In regards to the Shandian culture, in regards to their chiefs. So, 400 years ago, the chief that we meet is Coburn. And he is just their leader. He's not super involved. I mean, like he's the one that makes the decision that they need to sacrifice Moose to please Kashigami. And he gets very angry, of course, when Nolan shows up and kills Kashigami and frees Moose and everything. And he's kind of the one that does end up being okay with the fact that they made this deal with Nolan, that it's like, okay, if you can cure if you can cure the disease, fine. But if not, then, you're going to get sacrificed too or whatever. And so he's part of that. And then we also know that after Nolan is able to cure them of their disease, he is very happy and he appreciates the cure and everything. And, eventually it ends up being that, him and Nolan get along fine at that point in time. But then because Nolan and his crew end up, cutting down the trees and everything like that, he becomes quite, angry about that, as does the rest of the village. And when Nolan finds out about that, he is, of course, he's very sorry for what happens, but he's not quite able to, apologize as much as he would like. So I'm assuming that, by the time they all get knocked up into the sky with the knockout stream, I'm assuming Coburn is still the chief of Shandia at that point in time. And I am going to talk about Kalgara a little bit, even though he's not necessarily like the ruler of the island or the ruler of the Shandians. He is still a very important figure, and I did want to at least go over him a little bit. And what ends up happening is, of course, Colburn, along with the rest of the Skypeans, ends up in Upper Yard with, that's where their island ends up, or part of their island ends up. And eventually they're all kicked off of that by, the god of the time, which I'll go over in a moment. Currently in the Skypiea, the current chief of the Shandians, we actually do not know his name. He is just called Shandia Chief. He's like one of the few characters that we actually have like an information card on, but we don't actually have his actual name. We also do not know if he is a descendant of Coburn, because we don't know if like the chief setup for the Shandians is like a hereditary thing. Like it's like, oh, it's passed down to son or daughter or whatever, passed through the family line, or is it based off of a trial? We don't know. It's never stated, although I'm going to assume that it's probably just like, family lineage passed down the line on like oldest child or something like that, or oldest son or whatever. He's not this Shandian chief for the current timeline for what happens during the Skypiea arc. He's not super involved. The most that we get is like we see a flashback with him and Wiper talking about Kalgara and his good friend Block Nolan and everything, and that's what gives Wiper this this drive to want to find the golden bell within Upper Yard and ring it again to try to complete their ancestors' promise. By the end of the arc, the Shandian chief and Gonfall have actually become friends at this point in time, because Gonfall, he fought against Edaru, he fought to do what he could, and now he wants to try to make Skypiea a better place, not just for the Shandians, or not just for the Skypeans, but also for the Shandians. So that's developed that relationship, and we know that 2 years later, during the Decks of the World stuff, when we get like a check-in on the different characters for like the Where They Are Now stuff, we know that the Shandian chief and Gonfall are actually good friends at that point in time, have become much better friends at that point in time, and that they're sharing just like, a glass of like pumpkin juice in like Upper Yard or something like that, or outside of like Gonfall's house or whatever. So we can see that progression and how the different groups have gotten along, how they've just become better acquainted with each other, and how they've just kind of like not put 100% of their differences behind, and like the conflict behind, but they're to the point where it's just like, okay, it's time to move forward and everything like that. So I like what they're showing there with that, what Oda is showing with that. Now I'm going to talk about Calgary a little bit. As I stated, I know that he is not one of the actual like official rulers or leaders or royals of the Shandorians or of the Shandians at the time, 400 years ago, before they get sent to Emperor Yard. But he is this very important figure in regards to their history, because him being this great warrior and everything, he was like the main reason why other like pirates and other people weren't able to get onto the island for a good chunk of time, was because he was so strong and such a fierce fighter. And eventually, of course, he ends up, of course, coming to blows and into conflict, of course, with Nolan, because of what happens with Nolan showing up and decapitating Kashigami and saving Moose and everything from being a sacrifice. And, you know, Calgary, of course, doubts that Nolan is able to actually make this cure that can help, you know, help cure their people and make everybody better. And because of Nolan's conviction, that actually speaks a great amount of volumes to Calgary and results in Calgary actually killing the giant snake that is Kashigami's child. And, you know, this starts this shift in the fact that, like, Calgary goes from being willing to have his daughter sacrificed to Kashigami, you know, like a day prior, willing to have that happen, even going so far as to tell her to take the dagger or knife or whatever that's there and, you know, finish the sacrifice herself, so that way they can, you know, appease the gods. And, you know, now because of this conversation that he has with Nolan, where Nolan's like, no, it's not a god, it's just a giant snake. It's, you know, you know, you don't have to worship this way. You know, Calgary, because he does not want to actually sacrifice his daughter, he, you know, he kills this other snake that is, as I say, Kashigami's grandchild, and starts this shift where he's like, okay, you know, that other snake was not a god, or is viewed as a god. This thing is kind of viewed as a god. And at this point in time, I just want to be able to save my daughter. And if you can do that, then okay. And that's, you know, that's why he helps Nolan, and what results in, you know, them being able to, you know, get the cure and everything for the tree fever. And eventually, of course, this results in, you know, Nolan and, you know, Calgary being exceedingly good friends for the rest of the time frame that Nolan is on the island, until everything happens with the trees. And then, of course, you know, Calgary is the one that makes this promise with Nolan, you know, as Nolan and the rest of his crew are like sailing away. Calgary makes this promise that, you know, we'll ring the bell and it'll help guide you back here someday so we can see each other again, my friend. So, you know, that's where that promise comes from. And the legacy of that promise stands. You know, we see, you know, 400 years later, Wiper is, you know, again, you know, taking up his, well, I was going to say spear, but he has a bazooka, not really a spear, taking up his bazooka and doing everything he can to try to, you know, achieve his ancestors' promise, because, you know, the Shandians have passed this promise down from generation to generation, even with kind of being an exile to a degree in Skypiea and being these outsiders and having to turn to this, you know, like harassing and stealing and stuff like that of other people that ended up there. I know that Wiper wouldn't have been around, or if he was, he would have been like a child whenever Roger was there. But I just like, what would Wiper have thought of Roger is kind of what I want to know, is one of those questions. Roger probably would have had a lot of fun trying to fight Calgary, in all honesty, if they ever ended up meeting. But one of the things that happens is, of course, when the knockup stream happens, Calgary, along with everybody else on the island, gets shot up into the sky, and they get, you know, their island lands in Skypiea. And while they're there, or once they're there, their island is set upon, their home is set upon by the god at the time. And he's just like, oh, and I'll get to him in a moment. He's, I believe, the next thing I will be talking about. He's just like, oh, this land is mine now, and just like basically kicks the Skypeans off of it, or kicks the Shandians off of their own land. Yeah, that's not reminiscent of anything that's ever happened in history at all. I want your land, but I've lived here for generations. Well, it's mine now. It's like, yeah, that's never happened at all. So now to talk about Skypiea for a little bit, for the last bit here. So, and of course, as I said, the next video will be specifically about Eneru, and the next one after that will be specifically about Gonfall, which some of that stuff will go over the same issues, just from different sides. So when the Shandorians end up in Skypiea 400 years ago, they are their kind of first interaction that they have with anyone from there is Uba'u. 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 I don't know. I don't think his name's ever actually said in the series. He is the god of Skypiea at that point in time, and he desires the birth that is Shandia, because of course to Skypeans, birth is very important because plants don't really grow that much in the cloud setup that they live in because of the pyrobrine forming the pyrobrine from the sea stone forming the island clouds, blah 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 blah. And you know, anything that is earth, that is land, is very precious to them, and that's why, like, oh, there's this huge chunk of land that just appeared here, therefore it must be divine that I must live here. And generally it seems to be that the person who holds the title of god within Skypiea is the person who is the strongest at that point in time. So Uba'u either was very, very strong to begin with, and he's just, you know, he's like, oh, this is mine now, and he sends his divine squad that are like his, you know, warriors and stuff like that, and to go in and claim, invade Upper Yard and start, you know, killing and, you know, displacing and, you know, getting the Shandians out of there, so that way they, you know, that way Uba'u can claim it for himself. Yeah, we know that Kalgra and Seto and the rest of the Shandians probably fought as hard as they could to try to protect their country, but unfortunately, to try to protect their island, their home, but unfortunately we know that that didn't go well. And they had to leave, and they have to live on a different area within Skypiea, on the different island clouds that are there. The conflict that Uba'u brings into play, of course, lasts for the next 400 years between the Shandorians and the Skypeans, and eventually, you know, that led to Kalgra's death, and eventually it leads to, of course, Eneru showing up. Well, I don't think Eneru particularly cares that much about this ancient war between the Skypeans and the Shandians. He's just like, I want that island. It's mine now. I'm going to become God. Yeah. And takes over that. Although we do kind of see this setup where it is kind of shown that there is like the god, and then the god has their subordinates. So that's kind of set up in the past. We saw that initially, of course, when we get to Skypiea, when it comes to Eneru and his priest slash vassal slash warriors, whatever. And then like his other warriors below them that are like his god's army. And then, of course, we see that also with Gonfall, where Gonfall has, like, his god's guards and with his setup of the army, which I'll go in much more in detail when I get to them. But so we kind of see that, you know, represented there as well, because, I mean, that makes sense if you're this god in quotes, as a title, that it would make sense that you would then have like subordinates underneath you, because you don't need to go and you're not going to want to go and deal with everything. You're going to want to sit around and bask in the lap of luxury, as much as possible, which we see Eneru do quite a bit. Also, Uba'u means steal, as in to steal, to take something in Japanese. So that's just the referring of the theft of Shandia from the Shandorians. And as I mentioned, last bit here, the island that, you know, is, you know, the other half of Jaya, that is Upper Yard now, that setup, so Upper Yard becomes this this realm of the god, this home of the god, where the god of the time and probably like whatever his subordinates, where they all live. And there's a temple that's built there, and that's where they probably live for the next 400 years or so from like whatever god at the time has gone down. And Upper Yard is considered holy land. And anytime someone steps foot on it, to a degree, unless Eneru is just, I guess, trying to, I guess, have a fun day and wants to have a game, like what happens, the Skypiea death game or Upper Yard death game or whatever it's called. He will just, you know, if someone gets to the Upper Yard without his permission and they're not someone he wants there, he will just destroy them. You know, a lot of the other gods probably did something very similar. Uba'u, as I said, doesn't necessarily seem to be the best god in the world, but, you know, Gonfall seemed to be better, and he is better that we've seen now, but, you know, there's been a lot of other gods in Skypiea, you know, between Uba'u and what happens with, you know, Eneru and Gonfall and everything in the current timeline. So, we don't know exactly if, you know, if there were ever any other of the gods that tried to make peace with the Shandians. Probably not. But we know that, you know, as I said, for the next 400-ish years, the Shandians kept trying to, you know, get into Upper Yard and get their land back, get to the bell, everything like that. Probably several of like Wiper's ancestors tried to do what they could to try to get to the bell and try to, you know, fulfill their promise of ringing the bell and everything, but that never happened. And as Wiper says, it's like he doesn't, you know, he didn't want it to be like this outsider coming in to ring this bell in regards to Luffy being the one to ring the bell when he defeated Eneru, but he, you know, Wiper ended up being okay with that in the end because the bell still got rang and it still, you know, fulfilled the promise to, you know, between Calgara and Nolan from, you know, 400 years ago. So, that's what I have for this. As I said, the next one will be about, Eneru and then Gonfall. So I thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. This should be coming out the week of the 4th of July, which I will have had an exceedingly busy weekend. I have a wedding to go to. I have a big family party. I have another big family party that is a family reunion. And then within that same day, I have another big family party that involves a lot of fireworks because my aunt and uncle and their kids and a lot of my cousins are very much fireworks people and alcohol. And way too many of them. As in way too many fireworks. So I will have fun with that. But, oh well. It'll still be nice getting to see family. So I thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you have a nice rest of your day. Bye!